businesses depend on electronic equipment, moving to a paperless environment through the use of software on iPads to read board documents. So no longer do they have volumes of paper to say these are the board papers. Everything is done electronically now. So the changing landscape has a significant effect on directors, how they conduct themselves, and it also has changed the way in which they communicate. So the communication is also done electronically. The availability of obtaining and reviewing board documents can be done now in a timely manner because, of course, it's all electronic. So even the concept of share ownership has changed because people no longer do paper share certificates. That's also done electronically. So in the financial sector, the G20, the OECD principles of corporate governance that help policymakers evaluate and improve the legal, the regulatory, and the institutional framework for corporate governance, with a view to supporting economic efficiency, sustainable growth, and financial stability. And these principles become an international benchmark for policy makers, investors, corporations, and other stakeholders worldwide. They have also been adopted as one of the Financial Stability Board's key standards for sound financial systems, and they form the basis for the World Bank reports on the observance of standards and codes in the area of corporate governance. So because of all of these scandals over the years and the tightening of regulations, you see that corporate governance has become a very important part of running a corporation or a company. And don't forget now, corporate governance has to do with the board managing the risk. And in particular, they look at reputation risk. Then they also look at ethics, because the board sets the tone for the organization. So the principle states that the purpose of corporate governance is to help build an environment of trust, transparency, and accountability necessary for fostering long-term investment, financial stability, and business integrity, thereby supporting stronger growth and more inclusive societies. So the principles focus on publicly traded companies, both financial and non-financial, but you can also apply them to privately owned companies. So the UK Code defines in 1992, corporate governance as a system by which companies are directed and controlled. The board of directors are responsible for the governance of their companies. The shareholders' role in governance is to appoint the directors and the auditors and to satisfy themselves that an appropriate governance structure is in place. And that definition still remains true to today. The OECD principles define corporate governance as involving a set of relationships between the company's management, its board, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. Corporate governance also provides the structure through which the objectives of the company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. So part 6 of the principles set out the responsibilities of the board, and that the corporate governance framework should ensure the strategic guidance of the company, the effective monitoring of management by the board, and the board's accountability to the company and the shareholders. So you can see that in running a company, the board is critical to whether or not a company performs well or not. The shareholders are the investors, and what they're looking for is a return on their capital. So the responsibilities of the board. The board is mainly responsible for its corporate strategy, monitoring managerial performance, and achieving an adequate return for shareholders. At the same time, preventing the conflict of interest and balancing competing demands on the corporation. That is the responsibility of the board. To effectively fulfill their responsibilities, the board must be able to exercise objective and independent judgment. The board is also responsible to oversee the risk management system and systems designed to ensure that the corporation conforms to applicable laws, including tax, competition, labor, the environment, equal opportunity, health, and safety laws. So that's also one of the responsibilities of the board. In some countries, companies have found it useful to explicitly articulate the responsibilities that the board assumes and those for which management is accountable. So they differentiate between the two. And you'll see that later down in a section I excerpted from the central bank's corporate governance guidelines, where it sets out the duties of the board and then the duties of management. The board also has a duty to act in the best interest of the company and its shareholders. It is expected that the board to take due regard of and deal fairly with other stakeholder interests, including those of the employees, the creditors, the customers, suppliers, and local communities. Observance of environmental and social standards is relevant in these circumstances because, you know, everything now moves towards, in a company, moves towards sustainability, which means looking at the environment and its impact. And its impact depends on what the company does, or where the company is situated, or where the company wants to build subsidiaries, or if it's using natural resources. It all is a part of the environment and whether it's giving back to society. So the guiding principles of the board are as follows. Board members should act on a fully informed basis in good faith, with due diligence and care, and in the best interest of the company and the shareholders. So the principle states that there are two elements of the fiduciary duty of board members. Always remember that board of directors have a fiduciary duty. One is that duty of care, and the second is that duty of loyalty. The duty of care requires board members to act on a fully informed basis in good faith with due diligence and care. Some jurisdictions, there is a standard of reference, which is the behavior that a reasonably prudent man would exercise in similar circumstances. And the principle calls for board members to act on a fully informed basis. Good practice takes this to mean that they should be satisfied that key corporate information and compliance systems are fundamentally sound and underpin the key monitoring role of the board advocated by the principles. So that means that when senior management report to the board, it is the board's job to ensure that the information provided is relevant and accurate, but also that the company is in compliance with all of the relevant laws and that it has the systems in place to not only identify and assess those risks, but also to monitor those risks, and that there are mitigation tools in place. The second is the duty of loyalty, and that underpins effective implementation of other principles in this whole corporate governance framework. For example, the equitable treatment of shareholders, the monitoring of related party transactions, the establishment of remuneration policy for key executives and board members. It is also a key principle for board members who are working within the structure of a group of companies. Even though a company might be controlled by another enterprise, the duty of loyalty for a board member relates to the company and all of its shareholders, and not to the controlling company of the group. B, board decisions may affect different shareholder groups differently, and the board should therefore treat all shareholders fairly. They have to carry out their duties in an even-handed manner with respect to all shareholders. And this principle is particularly important to establish in the presence of controlling shareholders that de facto may be able to select all board members. The board should apply high ethical standards, and it should take into account the interests of stakeholders. The board has a key role in setting the ethical tone of a company, not only by its own actions, but also in appointing and overseeing key executives and consequently, management in general. And so now you see how these risks intertwine with corporate governance and the board. And that's why it always said that the tone starts from the top. To make the objectives of the board clear and operational, many companies have found it useful to develop codes of conduct and to communicate them throughout the organization. And at a minimum, the ethical code should set clear limits on the pursuit of private interests, including dealing in the shares of the company. So you have the code of conduct and you also have the conflict of interest policy. D, the board should fulfill certain key functions, including reviewing and guiding corporate strategy, major plans of action, risk management policies and procedures, annual budgets and business plans, setting performance objectives, monitoring implementation and corporate performance, and overseeing major capital expenditures, acquisitions, and divestitures. All of these matters go before the board because remember, they have the answer to the shareholders. So the board should have oversight of the company's risk management. And this will involve oversight of the accountabilities and the responsibilities for managing risk, specifying the types and degree of risk that a company is willing to accept in pursuit of the goals, which means that the board has to develop the company's risk appetite and how it will manage the risk it creates through its operations and relationships. Another function is monitoring the effectiveness of the company's governance practices and making changes as needed. Monitoring of governance by the board includes continuous review of the internal structure of the company to ensure that there are clear lines of accountability for management throughout the organization. In some jurisdictions, self-assessment by the board of their performance, as well as performance reviews of individual board members and the chair and the CEO. It is best practice that this is done annually. You'll see the corporate secretary, she would direct by the chairman to conduct a self-assessment of the board and its performance. The next is selecting, compensating, monitoring, and when necessary, replacing key executives and overseeing succession planning. Then aligning key executive and board remuneration with the longer term interests of the company and its shareholders. It's good practice for boards to develop and disclose a remuneration policy statement covering board members and key executives. The statement should specify the relationship between remuneration and performance and include measurable standards that emphasize the longer run interests of the company over short-term considerations. It's considered good practice that remuneration policy and the contracts for board members and key executives be handled by a special committee of the board, comprising either wholly or majority of independent directors and excluding executives that serve on each other's remuneration committees, because that could be a conflict of interest. Another principle is ensuring a formal and transparent board nomination and election process. Shareholders have an active role in the nomination and election of board members. So while actual procedures for nomination may differ between countries, the board or nomination committee has a special responsibility to make sure that established procedures are transparent and respected. When you look at any corporate governance guidelines, you will see that they would normally, a regulator would normally recommend various committees, which is based on the size and the complexity of the company. One of those can be a nomination committee, one can be a remuneration committee. So the board has a key role in determining the general or individual profile of board members that the company may need at any given time, considering the appropriate knowledge, the competencies and expertise to complement the existing skills of the board. And so the corporate secretary would prepare the skills matrix, and that's looking at each director reviewing their resume to see what skills do they bring to the board and whether or not those skills are in line with the goals that the shareholders have for the company. The next principle is monitoring and managing potential conflicts of interest of management, board members, and shareholders, including misuse of corporate assets and abuse in related party transactions. It is an important function of the board to oversee internal control systems covering financial reporting and the use of corporate assets and to guard against abusive related party transactions. Because whenever you have a related party transaction, it should always be done at arm's length. It is important for the board to encourage the reporting of unethical, unlawful behavior without fear of retribution. The existence of a company code of conduct, code of ethics should aid this process, which should be underpinned by legal protections for the individuals concerned. So you remember last class, we spoke about whistleblowing. 7th principle is ensuring the integrity of the corporation's accounting and financial reporting systems, including the independent audit, and that appropriate systems of controls are in place, in particular, systems for risk management, financial and operational control, and compliance with the law and relevant standards. The board should demonstrate a leadership role to ensure that an effective means of risk oversight is in place. Ensuring the integrity of the essential reporting and monitoring systems will require the board to set and enforce clear lines of responsibility and accountability throughout the organization. The board will also need to ensure that there is appropriate oversight by senior management. The board should attain final responsibility for oversight of the company's risk management system and for ensuring the integrity of the reporting systems. They should oversee the process of disclosure and communication. The board should be able to exercise objective, independent judgment on corporate affairs. So in order to exercise its duties of monitoring managerial performance, preventing conflict of interest, and balancing competing demands on the corporation, it is essential that the board is able to exercise objective judgment. And this means independence and objectivity with respect to management with important implications for composition and structure of the board. So you could see, the trend now in terms of corporate governance and risk management. It means that the board has to know all of the risks that are inherent in the business. What are the residual risks? How is the risk being monitored? How do you mitigate against those risks? And how those risks impact managerial performance? And in order to know or to be able to tell the shareholders that yes, the company is being run in the correct manner, the tone comes from the top. And that means that when the board report or when the board submits its audited financial statements at the year end, it has to show the performance that the board is carrying out all of its duties and its responsibilities. Any comments so far?
Yes, just one question. I know you said, the board is responsible for risk management and everything, but when you look at smaller companies where you have the director or / CEO acting in the capacity of the risk manager, is that not a conflict? Because it should be like an independent function, yes?
Yes, it is an independent function.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There has
No, I just
someone else in the organization who can deal.
Okay.
Because remember now, as a board or as a director, he has to exercise independent judgment.
Yeah.
So how can he exercise independent judgment if he is preparing the risk reports?
True. That's true.
How can he, right? So how can he exercise independent judgment if he's preparing the financial statements? Yeah. Because as a director, he has a fiduciary duty. And that fiduciary duty means that he can be sued. So even in a small company, that function should be carried out by someone else. Anybody else have any comments? Because I want you to look at everything that you have studied so far in this whole course, and you need to bring it together now. Because once you get this designation and you've done this course now, you should be able, if you are appointed to a board, to know what your role is. What are you responsible for? What is risk? Even if on the other way around, now you were to join a risk team, you have to know your role as a part of the team. And you also need to know what information you need to give to the board in order for them to carry out their function.
Can a compliance officer also be a director? Is that
No.
a conflict?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, won't work. Any more comments? Think about it now. You're going to have to use this designation. So you need to think about how you're going to use this designation behind your name, CIRM. Because you could even be in the role as a corporate secretary. You still need to know risk. Because you need to know whether senior management is presenting the right reports to the chairman to be disseminated to the board members. So everything depends on the role that you play. So independent board members can contribute significantly to the decision-making of the board. What they do is they bring an objective view to the evaluation of the performance of the board and management. That's why you have independent directors. They play an important role in areas where the interests of the management, the company, and its shareholders may diverge, such as executive remuneration, succession planning, changes of corporate control, takeover defenses, large acquisitions, and the audit function. They play a very key role in the audit function. It is desirable that boards declare who they consider to be independent and the criterion for that judgment. So you know if you're a regulated entity, the regulator requires for you to have independent directors. And in some jurisdiction, they required separate meetings of independent directors on a periodic basis. And that's done here in the Bahamas if it's a regulated entity. They do have separate meetings for independent directors. So board should consider assigning a sufficient number of non-executive board members capable of exercising independent judgment to tasks where there is a potential for conflict of interest. So that means that when the board establishes certain committees, what they tend to do is they appoint the independent directors on some of those committees. Examples of such key responsibilities are ensuring the integrity of financial and non-financial reporting, the review of related party transactions, nomination of board members and key executives, and board remuneration. All of those things help to give a clear delineation between all of the directors and that independence for the committee members. So independent non-executive board members can provide additional assurance to market participants that their interests are safeguarded. The board should consider establishing specific committees to consider questions where there is a potential for conflict of interest. And now you can see why there is such a drive to have non-executives on the board. Because you know the conflict of interest is one of the main or the hot topics when it comes to corporate governance. The board should consider setting up specialized committees to support the full board in performing its functions, particularly in respect to audit and depending upon the company's size and risk profile, also in respect to risk management and remuneration. So larger companies will have an audit committee, they would have a risk committee, they would have a remuneration committee. So everything depends on the size and the complexity of the company. So when committees of the board are established, their mandate, the composition, and the working procedures should be well defined and disclosed by the board. The board members should be able to commit themselves effectively to their responsibilities. So that means that you can, as a director, you cannot be on a lot of boards. Because if you're on a lot of boards, that means that when you come to a board meeting, you cannot contribute fully to that board meeting. So in some countries, they limit the number of boards that you can actually sit on. The board should regularly carry out evaluation to appraise their performance and assess whether they possess the right mix of background and competencies. So like I said before, everything depends on what are the goals and the strategies of the organization at that point in time. If the strategies change, then you will see they will change their directors. Or if the company is not performing the way in which the shareholders expect it to, they look at the composition of the board and they change it. Board evaluations can be supported by external facilitators to increase objectivities. Unless certain qualifications are required, such as for financial institutions, this might include the board members acquire appropriate skills upon appointment. Thereafter, board members may remain abreast of relevant new laws, regulations, and changing commercial and other risks. So it depends on the company itself. The composition of the board is based on the nature of the business, who its competitors are, where they operate. Of course, you would always have a legal person on the board. You would also always have a financial person on the board. And depends on your clientele, you may want to select someone on the board who knows your clientele and what they demand, because that helps in terms of looking at strategies, marketing strategies, when they come to the board and the profitability of the company. In order to fulfill their responsibilities, board members should have access to accurate, relevant, and timely information. Non-executive board members do not typically have the same access to information as key managers within the company. So providing access to certain key managers within the company, for example, the company secretary, the internal auditor, and the head of risk or the chief risk officer, is normally the persons who the independent director would liaise with in order to get more familiar with what happens in the organization. But remember, in order for the board to make decisions, it must have timely and accurate and relevant information. And that's where it depends on senior management. So when employees' representation on the board is mandated, mechanisms should be developed to facilitate access to information and training for employee representatives so that this representation is exercised effectively and best coordinates to the enhancement of board skills, information, and independence. Employee representation on boards should be applied in a way that maximizes its contribution to the board's independence, competence, and information. Employee representatives should have the same duties and responsibilities as all other board members and should act in the best interest of the company. Procedures should be established to facilitate access to information, training, and expertise, and the independence of employee board members from the CEO and management. So if you look from the US perspective and their response to all of the corporate failures, they would have introduced in 2002 the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and that was passed to regain public confidence. Remember, corporate governance is looking at the organization, its board, and its members. And whenever you see a reputation of a company begins to fail, then you know that public confidence also erodes. And so Sarbanes-Oxley seek to accomplish some objectives. prohibit conflict of interest, increase corporate accountability, increase accounting transparency, and form an oversight board to enforce the new rules. So corporate governance, here in the Bahamas and the central bank itself, I have set out the senior management responsibilities and then the board responsibilities. Because remember I said to you earlier that regulated entities, their corporate governance guideline will actually set out what are the roles of both the senior management and the board. But that's not to say that it covers all of the board's fiduciary duty. So we spoke about the executive and the non-executive director. And you see that today in corporate governance, the non-executive director is a very important role because they bring that independent judgment. So in the case of Jacques versus AIG Australia, Justice Dixon explained the difference between executive and non-executive directors. He said the essential characteristics of an executive director is his or her discharge, usually as an employee of executive functions in management and administration of the company. He said non-executive directors are usually independent of corporate management. In contemporary corporate governance theory, the role of independent non-executive directors is encouraged. The directors rely on management to manage the corporation. The board does not expect to be informed of details of how the corporation is managed. Another division of function is between the non-executive directors and the CEO or the managing director. A chief executive is a director to whom the board of directors have delegated its powers of management of the corporation's business. The degree of skill required of an executive director is measured objectively. In contrast to the managing director, non-executive directors are not bound to give continuous attention to the affairs of the corporation. Their duties are of an intermittent nature to be performed at periodic board meetings and at meetings of any committee of the board upon which the director happens to be placed. The office of managing director has powers of day-to-day management of a company that are exercisable without reference to the board as a delegated executive management function. Appointment as a director, other than as managing director, carries no express or implied grant of executive power. The position of director does not carry with it any ostensible authority to act on behalf of the company. Directors can only act collectively as a board, and the function of an individual director is to participate in the decisions of the board. The term non-executive director refers to a person who is a director of the insured entity and who is not an executive director. A managing director is, absent special circumstances, as a matter of law, an executive director. So whether a director other than the managing director is an executive director is a question of fact. And it may depend on whether there's some feature of the company's constitution or conduct of the company in general, or of the board of directors that evidences the delegation of executive function. So it's how that person operates. So the independent non-executive director, they are intended to provide checks and balances to ensure that the licensees operate in a safe and sound manner. And that's taken from the central bank's corporate governance guidelines. And they also make sure that the interests of the institution are protected. It is considered a sound practice for all licensees to consider direct reporting of the internal audit function to the board through an audit committee or other structure comprising a majority of independent members. And like I said earlier, the recommendation or the best practice is to have committees, and on those committees, you have independent directors. The board should regularly re-evaluate the mix of skills that it needs to be effective and to be willing and able to change its composition accordingly over time. All directors, including the independent non-executive directors, are encouraged to make contact with the regulator to discuss matters of mutual concern. A director needs to exhibit skilled behavior, but the nature of what is considered skilled, it changes over time. So even though there are different regulatory differences across jurisdiction as to what's expected of a non-executive director and executive directors, always remember that in law, there is just one category, and that is director. There's no differentiation between the two. Any comments? No? So let's look at shareholders. We know that they have changed over time also. So shareholders today, they differ in their motivation, in their risk propensities, and time horizons. And that adds to the complexity for managers. The interest in institutional investors have changed the manager-owner relationship, representing more than 70% of corporate stocks. The form of ownership affect the managerial decision-making and corporate strategy. Equity owned by insiders represents an alignment approach to corporate governance, where self-interest by management can be mitigated by allowing the agents to be principals, so that by working toward their own interests, they are meeting the interests of other shareholders. Equity owned by outsiders represents what you call a control approach to governance. And this emphasizes outside owners' motivation to check on managers, to ensure that stakeholder interests are consistently being met and that equity owners receive the highest possible profit. So outsiders, there are three kinds. You have what's called as block holders, and that's just a single corporation or an individual people or government that owns the majority of the shares. You have institutional investors, and that's looking at pension funds or an insurance company or bank or foundation. Or you have venture capital, which is private equity. And that's a new company, and that needs funding. So the ability and interest of institutional investors and asset managers to engage in corporate governance varies widely. For some investors, engagement in corporate governance, including the exercise of voting rights, is a natural part of their business model. For other investors, it is through voting, which may be ineffective. Hold on one sec for me. Sorry, but somebody was at the door. Are you all there? Hello. Oh,
Good evening, I'm
Yes,
here.
ma'am, we're here.
okay. Any comments? Are you tying this into everything that you've learned so far?
Yes, ma'am, we are. I am.
Okay.
Yes.
No, baby.
So under the OECD corporate governance principles, the first one is an institutional investor acting in a fiduciary capacity should disclose their corporate governance and voting policies with respect to their investments, including the procedures that they have in place for deciding on the use of their voting rights. For institutional investors, the effectiveness of the corporate governance framework depends on their willingness and ability to make informed use of their shareholder rights and effectively exercise their ownership functions in companies which they invest. So this means that the institutional investor should disclose how they exercise their ownership rights with due consideration to cost effectiveness. For institutions acting in a fiduciary capacity, such as a pension fund, the right to vote can be considered part of the value of the investment being undertaken on behalf of their clients. Failure to exercise their ownership rights could result in a loss to the investor, who should therefore be made aware of the policy to be followed by the institutional investors. Disclosure of corporate governance policies include explicit strategies regarding the circumstances in which the institution will intervene in a company, the approach they will use for such intervention, how they will assess the effectiveness of the strategy, disclosure of actual voting records, either to their clients or, in the case of investment advisors, to registered investment companies to the market. Develop a continuing dialogue between the institutional investor and the company, such as background information about the markets. Secure appropriate human and financial resources to pursue the implementation of the policy in a way that the beneficiaries and portfolio companies can expect. Second, the vote should be cast by custodians or nominees in line with the directions of the beneficial owner of the shares. Custodian institutions holding securities as nominees for customers should not be permitted to cast the votes on those securities unless they have received specific instructions to do so. The rules should require custodian institutions to provide shareholders with timely information concerning their options in the exercise of their voting rights. Third, institutional investors acting in a fiduciary capacity should disclose how they manage material conflicts of interest that may affect the exercise of key ownership rights regarding their investments. Where there is a conflict of interest between the intermediary to vote their shares and exercise key ownership functions, which differs from those of direct owners, such conflict should be identified and disclosed, especially if the conflict arises from material business relationship. Fourth, the corporate governance framework should require that proxy advisors, analysts, brokers, rating agencies, and others that provide analysis or advice relevant to decisions by investors disclose and minimize conflict of interest that might compromise the integrity of their analysis or advice. So providers of proxy advisory services should disclose publicly and/or to investor clients the process and methodology that underpin their recommendations and the criteria for their voting policies relevant for their clients. Fifth, insider trading and market manipulation should be prohibited and the applicable rules enforced. These practices can be seen as constituting a breach of good corporate governance as they violate the principle of equitable treatment of shareholders. Next, for companies who are listed in a jurisdiction other than their jurisdiction of incorporation, the applicable corporate governance laws and regulations should be clearly disclosed. In the case of cross listings, the criteria and procedure for recognizing the listing requirements of the primary listing should be transparent and documented. That means the company should clearly disclose which jurisdiction rules are applicable, When key corporate governance provisions fall under other jurisdiction than the jurisdiction of trading, the main differences should be noted. Stock market should provide fair and efficient price discovery as a means to help promote effective corporate governance. Effective corporate governance means that shareholders should be able to monitor and assess their corporate investments by comparing market-related information with the company's information about its prospects and performances. And when shareholders believe it is advantageous, they can either use their voice to influence corporate behavior, sell their shares, or they can reevaluate a company's shares in their portfolio. The corporate governance framework should recognize the rights of stakeholders established by law or through mutual agreements, and encourage active cooperation between corporations and stakeholders in creating wealth, jobs, and sustainability of financial sound enterprises. It is in the long-term interest of corporations to foster wealth-creating cooperation among stakeholders. The governance framework should recognize the interests of stakeholders and their contribution to the long-term success of the corporation. The competitiveness and ultimate success of a corporation is a result of teamwork that embodies contributions from a range of different resource providers, including investors, employees, creditors, customers, suppliers, and other stakeholders. The rights of stakeholders that are established by law or through mutual agreements are to be respected. So the rights of stakeholders are often established by law. For example, labor laws, business law, commercial law, environment, or insolvency law. Stakeholder interests are protected by law. Stakeholders should have the opportunity to obtain effective redress for violation of their rights. Mechanism for employee participation should be permitted to develop. Where stakeholders participate in the corporate governance process, they should have access to relevant, sufficient, and reliable information on a timely and regular basis. Stakeholders, including individual employees and their representative bodies, should be able to freely communicate their concerns about illegal or unethical practices to the board and to competent public authorities, and their rights should not be compromised for doing so. Therefore, it is to the company's advantage and its shareholders to establish procedures and safe harbors for complaints by employees, either personally or through their representative bodies and others outside the company concerning illegal and unethical behavior. The board should be encouraged by laws and or principles to protect these individuals and representative bodies by utilizing the following options: giving stakeholders confidential direct access to someone independent on the board, often a member of an audit or an ethics committee, and establishing an ombudsman to deal with complaints. And then, of course, there are other examples. Employees are encouraged to report their bona fide complaint to the competent authorities, and the company should refrain from discriminatory or disciplinary actions against such employees or bodies. And the corporate governance framework should be complemented by an effective, efficient insolvency framework and by effective enforcement of creditor rights. So the framework for corporate insolvency varies widely across countries. In some countries, when companies are nearing insolvency, the legislative framework imposes a duty on directors to act in the interest of creditors, who might therefore play a prominent role in the governance of the company. Other countries have mechanisms which encourage the debtor to reveal timely information about the company's difficulties so that a consensual solution can be found between the debtor and his creditors. Creditor rights also vary, ranging from secured bondholders to unsecured creditors. Insolvency procedures usually require efficient mechanisms for reconciling the interests of different classes of creditors. And in many jurisdictions, provision is made for special rights, such as through debtor in possession, financing, which provides incentives protection for new funds made available to the enterprise in bankruptcy. So you see, corporate governance is concerned with not just the board, not just with senior management, but also with independent directors, and also looking at the shareholders themselves and all of the other stakeholders. Any comments? So the last section we're going to look at with dealing with corporate governance and its role in risk management is financial disclosure and non-financial disclosures. A strategy that all companies deploy to improve shareholder protection is to provide investors with more transparency. And in most countries, there have been dramatic changes in transparency standards. At a minimum, public disclosure is typically required on an annual basis, though some countries require periodic disclosure on a semi-annual or quarterly basis, or even more frequently in the case of material developments affecting a company. Disclosure requirements are not expected to place unreasonable administrative or cost burdens on enterprises, nor are companies expected to disclose information that may endanger their competitive position unless disclosure is necessary to fully inform the investment decision and to avoid misleading the investor. The decision as to what should be disclosed is based on materiality. Material information can be defined as information whose omission or misstatement could influence the economic decision taken by users of information, or information that a reasonable investor would consider important in making an investment or voting decision. Disclosure can also be a powerful tool for influencing the behavior of companies and for protecting investors. A strong disclosure regime can help to attract capital and maintain confidence in the capital markets. Disclosure also helps improve public understanding of the structure and activities of enterprises, corporate policies, and performance with respect to environmental and ethical standards, and companies' relationship with the communities in which they operate. Now, the OECD corporate principles on disclosures and transparency, they have listed quite a few. The first is disclosure should include, but not be limited to, material information on the financial and operating results of the company's objective and non-financial information, the major share ownership, including beneficial owners and voting rights, the remuneration of members of the board and key executives, information about board members, including their qualifications, the selection process, other company directorships, and whether they are regarded as independent by the board, related party transactions, foreseeable risk factors, issues regarding employees and other stakeholders, governance structures and policies, including the content of any corporate governance code of policy and the process by which it is implemented. So you know that investors are interested in information that casts light on the future performance of the company. So the audited financials show the financial performance and the financial situation of the company are the most widely used source of information on companies. So that's why companies are always encouraged to disclose their policies and performance relating to business ethics, the environment, and where material to the company, the social issues, the human rights, and other public policy commitments. You know that one of the basic rights of the investors to be informed about the ownership structure of the company and their rights vis-a-vis the rights of other owners. So the right to such information should also extend to information about the structure of the group of companies and intra-group relations. And such disclosure should make transparent the objectives, the nature, and structure of the group. It is also good practice to disclose the shareholding of directors, including non-executive information about the beneficial owners should be obtainable by regulatory and enforcement agencies or through the judicial process. Companies are generally expected to disclose information on the remuneration of board members and key executives so that investors can assess the costs and benefits of remuneration plans and the contribution of incentive schemes. It's also important to disclose the membership of other boards, not only because of its indication of experience and possible time pressures facing a member of the board, but also because it may reveal potential conflicts of interest and makes transparent the degree to which there are interlocking boards. And of course, related parties should at least include entities that control or are under the control with the company. Significant shareholders, including members of other families and key management personnel. Related parties should be properly identified, and that in cases where specific interests of related parties are present, material transactions with consolidated subsidiaries are also disclosed. Risk that are specific to the industry or the geographical areas in which the company operates, dependence on commodities, financial market risk, including interest rate or currency risk, risks related to derivatives and off-balance sheet transactions, business conduct risks, and risks related to the environment, all of those foreseeable risks have to be taken into consideration. And those information is useful to market participants. So secondly is information should be prepared and disclosed in accordance with high quality standards of accounting and financial and non-disclosure and non-financial reporting. Disclosure standard is meant to improve the ability of investors to monitor the company by providing increased relevance, reliability, and comparability of reporting, and improve insight into company performance. Third, an annual audit should be conducted by an independent, competent, and qualified auditor in accordance with high quality auditing standards in order to provide objective assurance to the board and shareholders that the financial statements fairly represent the financial position and performance of the company in all respects. It is a good practice for external auditors to recommend an independent audit committee of the board or an equivalent body, and to be appointed either by that committee or body or by shareholders directly. External auditors should be accountable to the shareholders and owe a duty to the company to exercise due professional care in the conduct of the audit. And lastly, channels for disseminating information should provide for equal, timely, and cost-efficient access to relevant information by users. Filing of statutory reports have been enhanced in some countries by electronic filing and data retrieval systems. So companies' website also provide the opportunity for improving information dissemination, and some countries now require companies to have websites that provide relevant and significant information about the company itself. So all in all, in this module, you looked at reputation risk, you looked at branding, you looked at ethics, you also looked at corporate governance, its relationship with its shareholders, its stakeholders, the role of the board, senior management, and also the independent executive. You also would have covered the disclosure requirement for companies moving away from the scandals that happened in the 1970s and 80s and early 2000s, and looking at how corporate governance has changed over time. Any comments?
Ms. Archer, you talked about companies having websites. Is that even relevant in this day and age? In the sense of social media? A lot of companies have like maybe Instagram, not necessarily a website, or they probably don't update their website as frequent as they should.
Yeah, the purpose of the website from an investor point of view is you should be able to retrieve the audited financial statements. So, okay, if you were to look up any company now on Google, their latest audited financials are there. And they tell you who are the senior management team, and they'll also tell you who are the investors, if they are public companies. If not, they say they are private investors.
Okay, so that's more for private companies. Sorry, public companies.
Yeah.
Publicly traded companies.
Yes. There may some private companies that have institutional investors. And if those institutional investors have subsidiaries around the world, they would put that on their website because it becomes a part of your brand.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Ms. Archer, I also find it interesting that we require, I mean, even if the licensees are not publicly traded, or if they are branches of a bigger conglomerate whose jurisdiction is overseas, we require them to publish their audited financial statements to the Gazette. When really and truly, I don't know if they have any stakeholders here other than the regulator.
Exactly. And then when you look at corporate governance today, what's the relevance of it? Because the whole point of publishing it is because you have stakeholders here. What stakeholders do they have here besides the employees?
Correct.
And
So,
right, if the employees are not even shareholders, I mean, really, what other interests they have? Sure that they're going to be paid or have a job.
right, exactly. I'm
Yeah.
sure their statements get overlooked in the newspaper a lot. And it's a
Because
waste of resources.
and it costs quite a bit to publish. But that's the point that you can raise when you look at corporate governance today and the whole purpose of public disclosure today. When it was initially set out, it may have been relevant at that time in terms of saying, yes, we're doing corporate governance. Yes, you're an entity operating within the Bahamas. But look at it now in terms of corporate governance. Who are the stakeholders? The depositors are not here. The creditors are. The only thing is that you're operating from in the Bahamas. And I think if you have the financials available at your office, if someone wants it, they can get it. Why are you publishing it here? Charging, they have to pay all of that money and no one is interested. It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway, because they still have to also publish that the statements are available at the office and/or make it available on their website.
Exactly. And so why do you have to publish it? There are no stakeholders. There are no stakeholders. So it's a waste of money. Because even when they publish it in the paper, it's insufficient money. I mean, it's insufficient information for you. If you were an investor to make a good analysis, you still need the full report.
Yeah, the guidance note is dated 2011, so it probably just needs updating.
And there goes your point, your takeaway. There goes your takeaway. It does. Because it doesn't make any sense. Not now, not at this point in time. Because the only people who are actually monitoring what that company does and whether or not that company is still viable is the regulator. So from regulator to regulator.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Any more comments? You have to tie this into everything you learned in CIRM now. And then you have to apply it to what you do. Anyone is a corporate secretary or aspiring to be one? No?
Oh, sorry, I was one.
Oh. Did you like it?
Yes, ma'am.
It's a good role.
Yes, it really is. I do miss it.
Yeah, it's a good role. And all of this is key to acting in that role. Because you have to know about corporate governance, you have to know about risk, you have to know a little bit about every risk in the company. Yeah. Anybody else?
I'm not a corporate secretary, but I work with legal counsel and corporate secretary of a company.
Okay. So you see how relevant this is, right?
It is relevant. She's basically the compliance person for the board.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that means that she must know the MEMS and arts. And then she also must know the Companies Act. And then she has to know all the laws. Like I said, for corporate governance, she has to know all the laws and the regulations that govern the industry in which you operate. And that's in the. Mm-hmm.
No, I was going to say yes, and along with the company's policies and internal policies and procedures.
Yes. And then making sure that everything that is submitted by senior management to the chairman is accurate. So she has to keep a pulse on the organization. So they play a very close role with whoever's the CEO or the managing director. They make sure that they have relevant and timely information to submit to the chairman. All right, any more comments?
Ms. Archer, would you be able to give us, I guess, an indication, guideline as to what will be on the exam? We know it's multiple choice, but sorry, you're breaking up.
Oh, I said it is multiple choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it could come from anywhere.
So we just go through the.
Just go through the notes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's go through the notes. I don't think there are that many questions. I think from this area is either 5 or 10 questions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that many. It's not that many. All right. So your exam is coming up soon?
Yeah, the 30th of this month.
Wonderful. It's right around the corner. Shouldn't be that bad. Come on. People pass this with flying colors. Not that bad. Not that bad.
Guys.
Y'all can do it. Others have done it before, so I know you all can do it. I'm sure you can do it. All right. So just go over your notes all of your notes. Miguel told you how many questions it is in total?
No, ma'am.
No? Hold on, let me see if I can get it on. Let me see if I could have him come on. Can we ask him, can you join the class? He's online, so let's see if he jumps in. Is he coming on?
Good night, ladies.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Pratt.
They're worried about the exam, Miguel.
Yeah, they should be. They should be very concerned and worried.
Understatement.
No. It's an open book, 60 multiple choice questions. Your lecturer is the one who created the questions. You guys, everyone should be okay. We have a very, very high passing rate for this class. If one or in a blue moon has to reset. So I would not worry. And you should be getting your results for your assignments this Friday.
Mr. Pratt, now you know we send this in from January. It is not.
Correct.
Mhm.
You killing me, man.
Are there any
You
mock
know
exams?
it.
Any
No,
past
we have-
papers we can review?
But mind you, yeah, I do have a mock exam I can send you guys.
Oh, awesome. Could you send it tonight, please? Thank you. God bless you.
I'll try. I probably won't be able to send it tomorrow when I get in office.
Well,
Okay,
I'll
we'll
call
remind you.
I'll call you. You know, I can call you.
Not a
I
problem,
can
not a
call you,
problem.
Mr. Pratt.
All right, so here's the deal. The passing mark is 60%. So when you get your assignment results, then you just need to add, you just need to know, like, yeah, I need to get so much on my final to pass. So if you get your results and it's 25 with a 40, then you know you have to score 35 out of 60 on your final exam.
Okay.
Seems fair.
Okay? So that's how that works. So yes, I wouldn't. Hey, let me tell you how people fail the exam. Because it's open book, when they spend all day looking through the book, trying to make sure they have every answer correct, and they run out of time and don't answer all the questions. That's when they run into trouble.
So is it just pass or fail, or are there tiers
No,
to?
there are tests to it. There's tests to it. I think it's, once we calculate it, it's 60 to 79 is a pass, 80 to 89 is a merit, 90 and above is a distinction.
Awesome.
Okay?
And when will we know the results of the exam?
You won't know the result the minute you finish your exam, the computer-based exam, the minute you finish it, you will know your
Oh,
results.
okay. Oh, it's online.
Yes, online computer. Okay, so you will come to the office with your course materials and we'll set you up on a computer and you'll take your exam on the computer.
You have computers, or we have to bring our own?
Pardon me?
We have to bring our own laptop?
No. We'll provide you a computer.
Okay.
And the course materials is the black binder we would have picked up from the office.
Yes, so if you have not picked up your binder yet, please come and do so. We have one or two laying around.
And that's all we need, right? That's the course material. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right,
Okay, Mr. Pratt.
not a problem. If any questions, please, I'll be in office between 9 and 12 tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay?
Will we need to bring calculators for the exam? Right?
That or not.
I haven't seen any calculations, maybe one or two, but you can, just in case.
Okay.
Okay.
Just in case. But no, we don't, they're not, no, we don't have that many. I know Jermaine's section of liquidity risk had some formulas for y'all to calculate. There might, but
Wow.
it's not heavily reliant on equations. Okay?
All righty. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So give any other questions, give me a shout tomorrow. I'll be in office between 9 and 12.
Wait, what time?
9 a.m. and 12 noon.
9 a.m. Okay.
Okay, so we're all good?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay, thanks. Good night.
okay, so everybody's good now, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So start studying. And like he said, it's not that difficult. We do get good results.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, so good
Thank
night,
you. Good
buddy.
night, everyone.
Okay.
See y'all at exams.
Good
Yes.
night.
All
Good
right,
night.
good night.
Guys.
Good night. Take care.
Good night.